with common recurring issues that can cause trouble, negligence, malpractice, or discipline. We looked at various areas, various topics, and also various vehicles and modes to put it on a platform and bring it live, including talking about CLE, talking about self-assessment tools and modules. Some of that self-assessment module that we looked at, you received with your materials for today. I think 55 pages of the Colorado self-assessment tools was sent out by Leonore. And it's good stuff. It's thorough, it's thoughtful, it's the result of a lot of hard work from a lot of people in Colorado, and it seems to be working out there. We decided in January that we were going to take PMBR and focus it on a single topic and see if we could bring to life a tool or a self-assessment tool or a CLE or some mechanism to help lawyers with technology issues and cybersecurity issues. And we decided that the best way to do that would be to join up with the cybersecurity committee. Walter and I talked this morning for a while about going forward here and just kind of outlined the way to go forward. In a way, it's kind of serendipitous and synchronistic that the PMBR committee, as I see, kind of as the platform and the tool making committee, and cybersecurity as the substantive topics and substantive issues side of it. And the two committees together, I think, can work together and perhaps come up with a very helpful and useful tool for practitioners in the areas of cybersecurity. So I'm going to turn it over to Walter at this point. He's going to talk about purpose and vision and going forward, and kind of take everybody's temperature and take suggestions about how best to go forward. So Walter, I'm going to toss it over to you.
Okay. Well, thanks, Evan. The Cybersecurity Committee has got the benefit of having some real subject matter experts. Some are on the call here and others weren't able to make it. But we got our folks together earlier, a subcommittee, to think about how we could help put together a PMBR resource for a self-assessment. And I think that's what the idea is, a self-assessment for lawyers. And being a self-assessment brings with it a lot of features that we need to be thinking about: how to make it accessible, how to keep it from being too intimidating, how to make it informative, and maybe create a self-assessment tool that'll give people an opportunity to dig even deeper into a particular subject that might be of particular importance to them individually. And so in going through the various topics that we thought would be of interest, we've kept in mind that we're imagining this tool will be most helpful for those who are in smaller firms who don't have professional IT staff, and help the small practitioners, the solo practitioners, to understand what they need to be aware of and what resources may be available to them to accomplish the things they need to do to protect their practices and even more importantly, their clients. And so in evaluating that, our subgroup came up with really 6 topics. We've got 5 of them here of the cybersecurity topics: communications, money, information storage, infrastructure, staff awareness, office culture. And one item that we need to add to that is cyber attacks, which we're all acutely aware of at State Bar, as to how disruptive and harmful those could be. And so what we thought we'd do is just give the combined group an overall view of why we think these 6 topics are appropriate for this experimental self-assessment tool. And then we can talk about how we're going to go about doing this. And I've asked Bryant and Folk to speak to the first 3 topics, that is communications, money, and information storage, and touch on why we think those are important to be included in this self-assessment tool for the practitioner. And then Brian Oden is going to address the infrastructure, staff awareness, and the cyber attack topics. So unless there are any questions about the general approach, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Brian Folk. If you fill us in on those first 3 topics, Brian, and why we think they're important. Yeah, you're on mute.
Sorry. Is there anyone who wanted to respond to what Walter just said before I start? Okay.
That would be a no.
Well, then I'll say welcome to my home office / guest bedroom / storage facility while we're preparing our house for a new baby. So one of the tricky things about having this type of a setup for cybersecurity is that cybersecurity is not easy to lump into various categories. One aspect of it naturally affects another, and it also doesn't tend to provide an easy, especially ethical approach, because again, it's got its fingers all over the board. And really the best thing that we've come up with is making sure that lawyers are aware of what they need to be paying attention to. I spend probably an hour a day just keeping up with the, relevant cybersecurity and data privacy information. So it's flat out impossible to expect that even with a cybersecurity robot with an attorney every single day of the week, that they'd actually be able to keep up with it. So hopefully what we can do is give people a self-assessment tool so they know what at least they need to be aware of when they're addressing security. So I'll start with the communications. And while we're going through this, I do want to make sure that if anyone has any questions, they can ask them. And if I'm not stopping, do something like this. I tend to have the attention span of a small house pet, so I will probably see it. First, starting with communications. Basically, you've got a duty to keep information confidential. So how are you doing that? Well, you got to break it down probably into 2 different groups. So how are you communicating with your clients? How are you communicating with third parties? Do the communication systems you have provide security? How are you using phones? Do you use a landline phone? How are you using email? Is your email secure? Is your email encrypted? How are you using text messaging? The bottom line is that if you're communicating with clients under the age of 40, they're going to be much more responsive to a text message. So are you sending them a message over iMessage between 2 iPhones, which is encrypted end to end? Or are you sending it, one has an iPhone, one has an Android, which means it's not encrypted? Are you using apps that are designed to protect confidentiality, like Signal or Telegram that make it so that not even the people who own those companies can access the information? Are you deleting text messages when they're done? Are you backing them up? There's a whole lot that goes into this. And the bottom line is there's no way you can keep all of this straightforward in your head. But what you need to be doing is making sure that the policies and procedures you have for communicating take into account this information. And so the best thing we can do, I think, is give people a checklist along those lines. Say, all right, do you know what kind of email system you use? All right, if you don't know, that's your first step. And it's okay if you don't know, but you have to find someone or pay someone who does, that can make sure you're in compliance with the rules. Same thing with messaging, things like that. If you want secure phone calls, it turns out all you really actually need to do is have two people with Apple devices, because FaceTime is also secured end to end, audio and video. Regular phone calls are not. So probably, I think most lawyers are at least somewhat in tune to the idea that they have to, keep their client communications somewhat protected. Where we start getting into much more difficult, or much more dangerous waters is with third parties. I think there's the reply all slip up. Number one, how are your email systems set up, and do you have it set so that you can't accidentally forward client confidences by hitting reply all? Are you sharing information that is potentially damaging on emails with multiple recipients? Are you using emails with multiple recipients to exchange financial or sensitive information? This is the real estate wire transfer example. It's a business email compromise. What happens is one person replaces another in an email chain, and you've got 5 people on the chain. You have no idea who's who. What about HIPAA? Are you sending HIPAA documents over email? Are you bound by HIPAA? Under the law, are you bound by HIPAA under the rules of ethics? You might be surprised to learn that those 2 questions don't have the same answer. So the big thing is to make sure that your policies and procedure reflect your needs when it comes to communication. As far as making sure that small firm practitioners have the information they need, this is the kind of stuff that you need to be aware of. You need to be aware of what areas need to be secured that you may not be thinking of. Does anybody have any questions or any examples of, you think, probably good ways to raise this issue? Anything beyond a checklist?
So Brian, what I'm seeing here is, and I've been taking notes, is really outstanding checklist, and a checklist with another kind of spreadsheet box with really important information about each item on the checklist, so that lawyers can prophylactically protect themselves from not only mistakes and negligence and being unaware, but also being able to protect themselves from unwarranted intrusions by their negligence. So is that, in your mind, as we roll this out, do you see basically a checklist here with some information, and then perhaps some links that people can click on and go if they want more information? Is that what you have in mind if we were to put it on the ground?
Basically, yes. I think that when it comes to questions like this, it's not a direct parallel, but I like the analogy of when you're in sales, there are 2 things that you can pitch to someone. You can pitch them a feature or a benefit. The feature tells them what the product does. The benefit tells them how that product helps them. I don't think if you go at lengths and discuss whether you have policies and procedures in place that secure communications by encrypting to a 256-bit or bank level encryption, I don't think no one's going to even look at it. But if you say, do you know how you talk to your clients when you're on the phone? Do you use a landline? Great. Do you not use a landline? Are you using the internet for your phone? Okay, well then there's some things you need to look into. Are you using a cell phone to call your clients? Great, that's fine. Do you know how you're talking to them? If you don't know, you need to find out. And you can, for any device, for any app out there, there are great 3 and 4 step systems that allow you to go in and find out exactly the answer to all these questions. If you don't know what question to ask, that's when you're screwed. And I think that what this can do is, by breaking down the process into very simple, how do you do this in your firm? Do you have something? And there are going to be practice specific ones. So a good example for the real estate closing people is, do you have a system to verify wire transfer instructions? Now that gets into about 4 different topics that would be on my list here, if I were talking from a strictly security point of view. But by breaking it into the very simple, do you have this? Is this something you do? If not, here's how. Here's a suggestion. And if the suggestion doesn't work, here's a phone number you can call to speak to somebody who may be able to help you, set up your own version.
Okay.
All right.
You're going to move to money at this point?
I'm going to move to money, even though it's really not particularly important to, lawyers or anybody. So in following along what I was just discussing is asking small firm lawyers how they do things. Probably the biggest area we can help lawyers here is mobile and internet banking. How do you access your accounts? I can give you an example. Like, for example, I set up my trust accounts so that I have to deposit checks in person. I love everything about all the technology available, but the bottom line is there's certain things I just don't trust. So what I think we just ask very simply is, do you have a process in place for recording your deposits and for making sure that your trust account is kept up to balance? Bigger ones for security would be, do you have a system for accepting money from new clients? Do you require money to be paid in person? Do you allow money to be paid over mobile apps like Venmo? Okay, and if you do, how are you confirming the source of those funds? If that money's not coming from who you think it is, that's a problem. Do you deposit checks without a person presenting an ID? Do you deposit checks that are mailed to you from someone who is a new client? All of these get into the various Nigerian prince scams and things like that. The other would be, how do you disperse funds? Do you wait for funds to be fully deposited, for the deposit to be confirmed and received? I mean, I'll tell you that most banks aren't even well set up for, when you ask the question, okay, can you tell me when the money is in the account? And they respond, oh, you mean when the money's available? I said, no, when is the money in the account? You mean when you can write a check? No, when is the money? And so you just got to have a system in place to know. Do you wait 3 days? Is this something where you're, based on who it's coming from? Do you trust the money? Various things like that. But the online banking system is probably where you get the biggest issues. Do you have 2-factor authentication set up? I think nowadays we can pretty much accept that most people understand at least what 2-factor or multi-factor authentication is. And if they don't, it's so front and center on every single login page of these online systems that you don't need to go too far into what it is, but just emphasize that it's a good thing to have. Do you have backup systems in place? Where do you keep backup codes? Really, it's, as far as cybersecurity goes, the biggest question you ask any small firm lawyers: do you check your bank statement when it arrives to make sure there are no issues. 90 days. Banks give you 90 days under the law to challenge anything that's going on. And if you're getting your statements electronically, that starts as soon as it hits your email box. So do you have a system in place? I think that when it comes to cybersecurity, money is actually, it's funny, money is probably the number one target. Financial gain is the number one motive for hacks in the world. But it's really, when it comes to the practice of law, it's more of a byproduct. People get to your money because you screwed up somewhere else. Any questions on the money front? Any specific issues that y'all think fits into this category?
I guess one thing I'll observe about that is it's not all cyber related. There's no way to separate responsibility over client money into different categories. It's all interrelated. But I don't have any questions. Any other comments or questions on the money piece?
All right, I'm going to try to get through this one as quickly as I can, because data storage is probably the biggest category that I would talk about when talking to the lawyers. And the questions you ask here is, do you know what you have? Do you know where you keep it? And do you know how it's kept secure? One of the first steps in any cybersecurity audit I perform is identifying where data is kept and what data is kept, because you have to go through and perform a data classification. You have set standards. There is confidential data. There is protected private data. There is non-public information, and then there is public information. You have to know where it is and how you keep it. So the big question right off the bat is, do you know where you store your confidential information? Are there policies in place that restrict the access to confidential information and how that confidential information is stored? The best example is that, do you allow your employees to save copies of documents that contain confidential information on their desktop, as opposed to in the server or in the cloud where it's accessible by the entire firm? It's really, really, really dry, boring stuff for more people, but it is probably the single most important factor when it comes to protecting confidential information, because if you don't know what you have and you don't know where it's kept, you can't protect it. The next question I would have is, you've got to address data in three categories. In cybersecurity, there's data at rest, data in use, and data in transit or in motion. In use, it's people are using it. There's not much you can do about it. But when it's data at rest, saved, stored, or data in transit, it needs to be protected. How do you protect it? How do you protect your saved data? How do you protect your data when you send it somewhere else? Good example of this. Say, does your law firm use a secure portal for sending large files? If they don't, then you can ask, okay, how do you protect large files that are sent electronically? Because if you're not using a secure portal, you need to be using something else that provides some sort of encryption. Otherwise, you're putting your data at risk. Data at rest. When your data is stored, how is it kept? Is it encrypted? It better be. I mean, it's incredibly important. It's pretty boring, but there are very simple policies and systems that can be put in place. But this is critical. Do you know what kind of data you have? And unfortunately, most law firms still respond to the idea that they may be target of hackers. Well, I don't have any information. I don't have the data. Every law firm has more unorganized, like gold mine treasure trove data that they don't think they have on every employee, every client, and every opposing party or, or party across the negotiation than you can imagine. The joke I always make is that the second, if I was a hacker, the second place I would go for dirt on somebody is to their divorce attorney. The first place I'd go is to their spouse's divorce attorney. And so how that data is kept is incredibly important. You have to know whether or not the data you have is personally identifiable information, because all of a sudden you get hacked and you're starting to get into data breach notification issues, not just ethical issues and potential malpractice. You got a potential call to the state attorney general's office and someone else coming into your firm to basically run an entire cyber attack audit, which I'm sure Brian will talk to you about here in a minute. The next step is, how do you back up your data? Do you back up your data? And do all of your backups happen at the same place? If one fire or one flood can wipe out all of your data backups, you're not doing it enough. Okay, you need multiple copies in multiple locations. That's easy to do, but it sounds hard. You also need to have your backup needs to either be a slow upload or not not network attached. Also sounds complicated, is not hard. These are easy things. I think, as you discussed earlier, is just the idea of having a checklist. Now, okay, do you know this? Okay, if yes, fine. If no, here's 2-3 resources that can easily show you both options and steps to make sure that you are at least improving your security. The last thing I'll talk about here is, do you have a data retention, data destruction policy? This matters a lot more for law firms than it does for most businesses, but most businesses now are finding, in the era of cybersecurity and data theft, this is becoming much more important. You need to have a system of how you keep data, what you keep, how long you keep it, and when it's destroyed, and you need to follow it. Because actually destroying data early can be bad, but having it way past when you should have it and then it gets stolen can actually be worse if you should have destroyed it and you didn't. So that's, of all the questions, these are I think pretty easily put into a checklist form that where you can have essentially an interactive form of, yes, no, and then maybe a next step down. Okay, if you said no, ABC, and there are so many ways to put very, basic resources available. The big thing I think that we can do is, when it comes to cybersecurity, there's never going to be one great standard. Every law firm is going to have different issues. And the thing that I think everyone needs to realize is, I try to tell people every time I'm talking about this, is the whole idea behind cybersecurity is to make yourself a harder target than the person next to you. You don't need to outrun the bear. You need to outrun the person who's with you. That's it. Hackers and criminals in general are, generally speaking, lazy. They are going to go for the lowest hanging fruit. So, if you can do anything to improve your security even a little bit, you will end up improving it a lot. And I think that if we provide these basic tips just to improve those things, I think that'll help.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Just that if you guys aren't scared already, you ought to be. And that's part of the purpose of this whole, I think this whole self-assessment is to scare you enough to realize that there's work to be done. And probably at any size firm, there's work to be done. So Brian Oden, you want to tackle these last 3 topics for us?
Sure.
For a minute?
I'll be happy to, and I'll be, I guess, to facilitate committee discussion, I'll admittedly be a bit less detailed. And I know Brian Fogt has a great wealth of knowledge here, and I appreciate all the things that you've got us thinking about here. We are talking about infrastructure primarily, and I guess this ties into really what Brian had just said, that all of these different topics really relate to each other. They play off of each other. And infrastructure, of course, focusing on what sort of protocols do you have in your or what sort of equipment do you have in your office as far as just the very things that you use between, you might want to talk about information storage, but just how is everybody actually connecting to these online databases, the internet, what sort of virus protection do you have, and things of that nature. I think infrastructure really kind of blends into just facilitating really the first three topics that were discussed. The staff awareness and office culture is kind of that thing where, and I guess maybe I'll pause and just say that, all of these different topics, we want to make sure they connect to the rules of professional conduct as well, and a lawyer's professional responsibility. And that's where I think some of the staff and awareness and office culture really plays in, because of course it's our duties under rules 5.1 and 5.3 to ensure that those that we supervise, employees, maybe paralegals, associates, whether they're lawyers or non-lawyers, that they are engaged in conduct that's compatible with our own conduct. And so it's incumbent upon us as lawyers to ensure that those that are working with us, that our paralegal who's working remotely right now, knows about the need to handle that information confidentially and is empowered to handle that information as confidentially as you, the lawyer, need to be handling it. So we want to kind of ask some of those questions too, about what office procedures, what office policies have you drafted? Have you reviewed them? Have you given your office staff training on this to make sure that they're aware of those different procedures? And then, getting into the notion of cyber attacks, I think a lot of us hear about cyber attacks. We certainly heard a lot about ransomware through the state bar in our experience. And we learned a lot about it in that experience. But there are so many other attacks out there that we just vaguely know about. And I think Brian had said this earlier, that if you don't know the question to ask, then you're kind of stuck in a really bad spot. And so I think empowering folks to help them understand what type of cyber attacks are out there and how those attacks can occur. Whether it's phishing scams or ransomware and all that. I mean, it's just, there's so many different things that are out there, and if we aren't aware of those things, those different programs or just attempts that hackers use, then we don't really know what to defend against. And so that's kind of, I guess, the other aspect, the sixth topic that we wanted to specifically identify for this potential resource. But then, like we've been talking about, listing out these different questions that we can ask the person that's taking this self-assessment as to their knowledge and their response. Like Brian said, a yes, no, and then if yes, perhaps hitting up a couple of different levels, but not getting too detailed, not getting too overly technical to the point where somebody just kind of gets overwhelmed with all this new information that's very foreign and just gives up on it. We want to make it something that's really, frankly, probably just hitting the surface of general cybersecurity, and hopefully giving folks resources to dive deeper as they go through. And that's going to be kind of the part of, I think, where I see clearly I'm not a subject matter expert on cybersecurity. We've got folks like you just heard from Brian Vogt and Patrick Brown from Lawyers Mutuals on this committee, Matt Cordell. So we've got a lot of really smart people who are very experienced in this realm. And what I'm looking forward to is working with them in tying it back to our responsibility as lawyers, our professional responsibility to handle this information securely, confidentially, but ultimately just achieving our professional responsibility through our use of technology. So that's kind of where I guess everybody's thoughts were on these different topics. And I know, looking at the time now, being 3:40, you've got about 20 minutes left of this meeting. So I wanted to give the opportunity for the committee members to ask questions of Brian and what he said, or just to kind of start discussing how do we put this thing together as far as creating a potential working group between these two different committees to sit down and start drafting some of these topics out. and locating these resources. I know our cybersecurity experts are the ones that are probably going to be the best folks to point us in the direction of some very good and accessible resources. But nevertheless, I guess I wanted to just kind of end it there and turn it back over to you, Walter and Eben, to see if you wanted to start generating some discussion amongst the committee members.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I think we all can see that these are very important topics. They can be very technical, and it's going to be a challenge for us. I mean, this is our first venture into the PMBR realm. We're taking on what is really a very important topic, but it's a very technical topic. So I think we're going to have to be very careful about how we do that if we want PMBR to be accepted and successful. So we're dipping our toe into this with a pretty sophisticated topic. I think we've got the subject matter expertise. We've also got the folks on the PMBR committee who've sort of got a bigger, maybe a longer view of what PMBR ought to be. And let's talk about how we meld these two things together, this cybersecurity issue and the concept of the self-assessment tool that we've thought about implementing. And
Walter,
and
Colin has his hand raised.
Thanks. I mean, when I was listening to both Brian Folk and Brian Oaten about this, it seemed to me that the questions that they were asking were things that are really thought-provoking to folks who haven't given much thought to these issues. And is it too elementary to try to assemble a list of those questions? I mean, if someone were to read the questions that Brian Scott and was asking, those rhetorical questions to us, and think, PMBR might be a way for you to begin to assess your vulnerabilities and your office's readiness for the 21st century. These are the kind of things we do. I mean, that would sell me, this is something I need to do. I need to do this self-assessment, or I need to get somebody to come in and look at me or get some help. It just seemed like as he was asking those things, my mind just kept, palms get sweaty. Your mind starts turning. You think, good Lord, what am I doing? I'm maybe doing a little of some of them, but not enough of all of them. And that somehow I think that might help raise people's consciousness.
Yeah, Ted, you had your hand up.
Colin, I think the Colorado people built their self-assessment tools pretty much like a quilt. They assigned small groups to build each module and then come together and stitch it all together when the individual piece is done. And so and Leonore, I think, and Brian had talked about this earlier, but it may be worthwhile to break these 6 cybersecurity topics down into 6 small working groups with somebody that's got subject matter expertise on each one of them, but to not load up one committee with all 6, but break them down and then come back together with a checklist and questions and rules of professional conduct, connections, links that people can click on, and kind of build it together in a cybersecurity quilt module. Anybody got any ideas on that?
One thought here. I've actually already got papers and presentations put together that directly link cybersecurity issues with the rules of professional conduct that I'm more than happy to send around. One thing I would say is, because of the interconnected nature of all this cybersecurity stuff, I like the idea of breaking it down into groups and maybe having groups responsible for one thing. But then what I would suggest doing is, when one small group is finished, that essentially you do just a one-spot rotation. And then the next group looks at this and says, well, okay, these topics raise this question for me. so that there's multiple eyes on each one. And also because I think it's really hard to break these into areas, and I think you lose some expertise by having one group just focus on one thing. I think that, the thing that this does, it raises questions. I also would advise one of the most important things is to make sure that we keep this as positive and emphasizing strongly that by doing these things, you can make yourself and your clients safer, and they're not that hard to do. Because as much as I do enjoy hearing that my presentations scare the hell out of people, fear is a terrible motivator. As soon as the fear is gone, the motivation is gone. So I would just advise that we keep to the positive mindset when we're discussing how we can present these matters to especially small firm lawyers.
So Brian, let me follow up. What you're saying is that we can break down in small groups, but when one group finishes its work on one topic, it passes that work on to the second group, and they receive the work of the sixth group, sort of in rotation around the six groups. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, kind of a carousel, or like how you used to back in elementary school when you used to grade other people's tests.
Right.
So I guess I want to just raise the issue. Brian just kind of mentioned it about having a paper already together that address the convergence of the cybersecurity issues with the ethical obligations that we have. It seems like at a sort of foundational level, we might want to do some education about how, these issues about, whether you're using FaceTime or some other encrypted type of telephones call, or if you're using encrypted email or not, how that impacts our ethical obligations. And Brian, I was going to ask you whether or not you were aware of putting on your ethics committee hat. Are there issues that we might need to think about from an ethics committee perspective, as far as rules we need to address to be sure that lawyers are aware of these technology issues as far as our ethical obligations? I just feel like at a foundational level, we need to be sure that lawyers are aware of the sort of the ethical obligations, and then we can build these PMBR kind of issue things on top of that. But first, we have to be sure we have a solid foundation in our rules to address these issues.
One thing I'll say is when I send around these papers, I've been accused of speaking too long and writing too much. The papers and the presentations actually address the ethical rules very thoroughly because I'm obsessive. So you'll see it affects a lot of them. It's pretty clear. And I think that's very important. It's very important that lawyers realize that this is not just something that can get you in a little bit of trouble financially, but it can get you in trouble with the ethics committee, and there's a lot of ways it can happen.
Well, I didn't, when I was saying things a while ago, I don't think the fear will solve the problem, but I think the awareness of some of the things that you mentioned about, one type of communication methodology or money handling might be much safer than others, and just the fact that you're aware of it might cause larger numbers of our folks to start adopting some of these easy practices, like you say, the low-hanging fruit that makes us just a little bit harder target to these kinds of fraud. If they knew, use this instead of that, I mean, I think those are the kind of things that rather than change their whole life, we can make little changes that might collectively have a bigger impact.
I think it's important for us to keep in mind that really fundamentally the reason for this self-assessment is to help lawyers comply with the rules of professional conduct, because that's really only the basis that's the core foundation upon which we really have the authority, so to speak, to engage in this whole exercise in PMBR. And Ted, I think you're right. We need to keep that as the focus and the foundation of what we're doing. Some of Colin's comment called me to think that maybe he's talking about a promotional or an advertisement for participating in this self-assessment tool that could be very entertaining and let's don't use the word frightening, just say motivating to get folks interested in doing it. So maybe we ought to also think about folks who would be interested in a promo, Catherine Fry, and to help us figure out a humorous but engaging way to interest people in trying this out.
Well, Walter, one of I would say perhaps the most informative thing that PMBR did that last year was a survey that Brian put together, and the survey was well received. We got back several thousand or more responses from members of the bar from across all types from solo, rural, urban, large firm, business firm. And so we've got some institutional history in doing some rollouts like that. Yeah, I think that would create some buy-in from the bar.
Open for any other comments or suggestions or questions from the group.
I'll say one other thing, Walter, and you and I touched on this briefly. What we put together to begin with doesn't have to be perfect. What we're looking for is a working, excellent product that can assist practitioners, that's easily accessible, that's not too intimidating. I think that, as Brian Folk said earlier, but or maybe that was you, Walter. But I think that if we focus on the basics and focus on really some of the more common and recurring issues, as opposed to getting really in depth and detailed, we're going to come out with a much better product that's going to be much more widely used.
Eben, Jerry Collins has his hand raised.
Just briefly, one of the things that I thought as a nuts and bolts kind of a tool kind of thing is that the Colorado PMBR seemed to some of those questions that address cybersecurity would possibly fit into what we're saying the cybersecurity committee would be trying to do. I don't know the extent to which our PMBR committee wants to utilize any of the Colorado questions at all, but they did have some that did relate.
No, Jerry, I made note on a few pages on the Colorado that really overlap with some of these issues with cybersecurity. We can, I think, rework, work to fit our purposes. We can lift from several of the modules, I think, to insert them into what we're doing with cybersecurity.
So when Evan and I talked earlier about what we'd like to do coming out of this, I think what we had in mind, if this sounds like a good idea to the combined committees, is that we get volunteers who would be interested in participating in work group on each of the 6 topics, the 6th one being the attacks, where it says others there on their agenda. And hopefully having a subject matter expert and those who don't consider them such on each one of these, and to solicit volunteers from the group who indicate their preferences, maybe their preference separately by 1, 2, and 3, and then we assign subcommittees to the project. And it seems to me that we may also have one other subcommittee, and that would be a promotional subcommittee or a group to figure out how we reach out to the bar and get people interested in participating in that. So maybe there are folks who would be interested in that as well. How does that sound to the group? I'm seeing a lot of nodding. That's good. So why don't we say we'll do this? I think everybody's got the emails for me and Evan. And after we conclude, if you will just indicate what your interest area is, we'll make sure everybody's assigned to one area of interest, which is, my nice way of saying, if you don't volunteer, we'll appoint you. I think we'll be off to a good start. And if we just add to this what's a better word for promotional or something to that effect, the group interested in promoting the participation in the self-assessment tool.
It's almost a marketing tool so that people understand what's there and how they can benefit from it.
Okay. So let's call that marketing then, Patty, and I think that's a great idea. So we now got 7 topics for people to choose from. And after we get off this call and we conclude it, if everybody will volunteer for those topics that they are most interested in, and just give us your top 3 in order of priority, and we'll try to match everybody up. Mac.
When we get off the call, could we get Brian to send a list of those 7 topics so we don't have to try and remember what they were?
Yes, I'll be happy to do that. And I was just going to say, let me wait for an email. I will send you an email with those topics, and you can respond directly to me. I'll accumulate all the different responses and get back to y'all.
Excellent. Well, Evan, thanks for inviting us to join your esteemed committee. We're humbled.
Well, we're sorry we missed you in January. I think you showed up, Walter, but the rest of your committee was under the misapprehension or misimpression that it.
Well, I like I prefer your recollection of the facts, which weren't exactly accurate. Maybe I was the one who was late and the rest of the committee showed up, but in any event, this has been a very helpful meeting. I appreciate everybody's interest. I'm excited about this project this year, and we got to figure out how to make a very complicated subject very accessible and interesting for our bar. And if we do that, I think we'll set a good foundation for the next step in PMBR, whatever that may be. So I'll turn it back over to you, Evan, since this is your.
All right, one final thing. One thing we didn't talk about, Leonore, was your work with the Wire Fraud Summit group and how that might sort of intersect with what we're doing here. So we really didn't touch on that, but that's for another day and another conversation. All right, so is everybody going to email Brian, and then we'll start these committees, and then we'll start the round robin once we get started here, and we're going to have a 7th committee. Walter, is that your recommendation to how we sort of a rollout committee? And I think Patty would be awfully good at that, and Catherine Fry also would be they seem to have natural talents in that area, but that's just me. Anyhow, think about it, Patty and Catherine, if you're on the, I know you record. I don't know if you got on the call or not.
Thank you.
Eben, this is Brian. I hate to go a bit backwards, but we do technically need to approve the minutes of both committee meetings. And so the cybersecurity minutes were in everyone's materials, as well as the PMBR minutes were in everyone's materials. I think it'd be appropriate to receive a motion to approve both minutes unless anybody has any changes.
So move.
Second.
All right, minutes are approved, Brian, for both committees. All right, guys, stay safe. One other question: anybody come in contact with COVID or had to self-quarantine at all up to now? Nope. That's good news.
I've had friends who have dealt with it, but not anybody in my family. It's serious. It's very serious.
Yes, it is. It really is. Okay, guys, stay safe, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.